take time right before the AP exam to be able to go over one of the examples of the previous essay that we had done and score it with you just to get an idea of what you might get. So if you could read along with me, pause the video at any time so you can take some time to read, but I'm going to roll through this as quickly as you can. So the first point we look at is the context point, and the author here writes about a particular context point right here, and starting at here to right here. Okay, so a few things. One, I see key terms like Great War and what it resulted in. Again, loss of many lives and not diminishing populations. And then you have the Treaty of Versailles. And not only that, but colonies trying to break free. These two don't connect all that well. Now, there's some key terms in it, and this is close to scoring the context point, but not quite, because you have to be able to connect this with the thesis statement. And think about it. We have in this issue, there's a pandemic going on. What creates a pandemic? It's about global connections. So your context isn't necessarily about these items here. This is not quite the prompt here for this, but it is about global connections and what connects the globe. Perhaps on one hand, the Great War connects the globe in terms of supplies, material, and others that are being produced at this time. And not only that, but we're looking at, let's see, um, colonies, the Industrial Revolution, connecting the world together such that it made these connections, made it such that a pandemic was more likely to happen. So again, it's not just simply finding the historical facts that work here, but it's connecting it with the notion of pandemic here. So what will help is a connecting term in between your context and your thesis statement. So I'm going to say, and I'm going to move on, and I'm going to use the scoring guide right here. Okay, the grade here for historical context, I would generally say no in this case here, but it depends on the score, depending on what the College Board decides here. It's close, by the way. Okay, so don't feel bad about that. All right, secondly, the thesis. Well, the influenza ravaged communities and killed thousands. Okay, religious people believed it was not right to fight against the disease. Now, just a quick reminder of the prompt itself here. And the prompt is about, if I can find the DBQ here, right? The prompt itself is about the responses to. Okay, so that's where you have to really take notice. The responses to the spread of influenza. Okay, so which one is the response? One, not to fight it is response number one, and isolation is response number two, both of which responds to the prompt well. And so as a result of this, this is your thesis statement. Okay, so I'm going to move over here to our grading rubric, and bam, okay, you have 1 point. This is one of the necessities. Okay. Religious communities thought of influenza as a good result of God or goddess anger. They believed that it's their punishment for some unknown reason, and it was incorrect to try to quell their God's anger for them. All right, so this is a good topic sentence. Okay, millions died, and so forth. All right, so here is evidence in terms of document one right here, okay, where one, there's an understanding of placing this in the correct location and what it is. To believe there's a visitation. So be careful with these terms here in, um, hey, because in effect, you're quoting the document without actually quoting the document here. Hey, use your own words. Okay, use your own words for the summary because that demonstrates your understanding and not just simply repeating the document itself here. So this yourself is good analysis. So at this point, this is evidence identification number one. So the document has been used. And two, because they didn't want to further anger, okay, they did not take up any means to protect themselves as such or accepting medical treatment here. So this is evidence that supports the argument in the first instance thereof. Okay. This document takes place in 1918. So here I see already there's an attempt to try to source the document using occasion. Okay, and the notion that British India and the rise of Indian nationalism constructed through particularly the notion of a Hindu identity as well here. So this itself, because of this and the influence of religion, they became much more unprotected. So this here is a correct example of sourcing using occasion. This is fantastic, by the way. Again, it's the easiest way to do. And according to this particular rubric, what that means is you have now sourced one document, in this case, using the historical situation, and that's a second point, just like that. Fantastic. All right, in the Christian Science Monitor document, this one's really tricky, by the way, but you can still use it because in the end, people said the sickness came from the Lord, and so therefore, continue to convene together. So using religion as a means. So this is now evidence, okay, that's been identified. The second one, purpose was to keep Christians. Let's see, I believe that sickness best to continue with congregations and convening in the church in these difficult times. Okay, so be very careful here. This is really close, in terms of, yeah, if your argument is, let me come back here. Religious communities thought the influenza was a result of a god or a goddess's anger, right? And that they deserve punishment, and that they incorrect to try to quell their anger. So again, this here is the key part in terms of the author's argument here. Okay, and so it has to be able to connect here. So why are people still practicing? Okay, so it's this part right here where it says they believe that the sickness came from the Lord's anger, so it's best to continue. So here is evidence that supports the argument. Now, according to this uh, rubric, what that means is that, first of all, they've used the content of at least two documents, so that's one point, and supports the argument using two documents. That's another point. So we're at four already, just like that. So author, fantastic job. All right. So here I see purpose. So this is an attempt now to use a purpose for a particular audience to keep Christians united by spreading the word of real causes of influenza. This isn't bad, except again, this document is tricky. It's sort of the Christian Science Monitor, at least in this time period here, particularly Christian Science, if you've heard of them, is considered by many at this time a cult. And so, as a result of this, they sort of a fringe attitude compared to the traditional American mainline religion. So, that's the tricky part of this document. Not very many students actually got this one here. And so, thus, you had a much more extreme view of um, how to handle the pandemic. All right, moving on. Influenza shook communities worldwide since it's so contagious, and the best way to prevent themselves from catching it was to put the sick in isolation. So again, here's the argument that relates to the thesis. Okay, so in this case here, there was a case where the governor of American Samoa, put the disease in, kept the boat in isolation here. Okay, so here, this is evidence that's been identified three. And again, the point that's being made is that they kept the sick in isolation. That was the response to the pandemic. And so, as a result of this here, this is evidence supporting the argument. The third occasion, isolation proved to be an effective way of keeping out the influenza since um, uh, in not all countries did so. All right, this place again in 1919, a year after World War I. So this is now an attempt to try to source a second time here using occasion. Okay. At this time, countries struggled to pay for the cost of war and rebuilding communities, making it easier for influenza to destroy further civilization. Now, this is true, but again, it has to apply to the prompt itself in some kind of particular means here. So the notion that that this is an American resident of not British Samoa here. So let me come down to the argument here. Come back to the document here. This is again, this is a colony that we're looking at. So British Samoa is a British colony at this particular time, and America Samoa is an American colony at this point. So what you can utilize here is not just simply, well, World War One has happened here. Hey, we have these colonies way far out in Oceania, right? And here are the responses that are made by some of the colonial governments. So in order to do occasion here, it's not just simply about World War One. It may be, look, countries struggle to pay for the cost of war, and now you have to now connect it with the fact that there are colonies that are maybe the absolute last priority of these empires as they recover from the First World War. Okay, so again, you have to connect the document with the actual time period as well. So again, a nice attempt, but it doesn't function here as sourcing. Okay, but a good idea nonetheless. Okay, and in reporting a British colonial government in Sierra Leone, okay, and people are being turned out to the streets and denied care. Okay, that is more than enough to say both evidence is identified in the right category and also being turned out in the street and denied care here. This is evidence that supports the argument a fourth occasion. Okay, so what that means is we come back to the rubric. Okay, supports an argument in at least four documents. We are at point number 5 here. Okay. And so 5 points. Fantastic so far. All right. Even if the government has not formally called for isolation, they recognize the contagiousness of the disease and how it can be avoided by staying away from those who are sick. Again, that supports that argument further. British colonial government and Sierra Leone are separated from Britain and need more resources, especially after the war. So, now again, here's that same explanation as well. It comes back to the why. So it depends on the author here in terms of being able to connect. And let me go and highlight this for you here. Connect this particular point here. A report by the colonial government. Let me come back to. Okay, countries are struggling to pay for the cost of war, okay, the cost of war and the rebuilding communities, right? And thus, therefore, Syria are separated from Britain, especially after the war. Now, there's a question if this is enough here. Okay, can the reader make these two connections? Because if the reader does, then what that is, this is sourcing again using occasion, except this is now the second time in this case here. Hey, it depends. This one's really close. I think just because it's the same point that's laid out here, I would venture to say, but I'm not 100% sure. It depends on how the grading actually goes here, that this may actually be a second historical document using historical situation, and that might be another point right here as such. So I'll give you the benefit of the doubt here. All right, finally, let's go ahead and move on from there. All right, because influenza, communities separated themselves with isolation while others kept to religion. This is a restatement of the thesis, which is always important if you didn't get that first thesis point. Those who tried to stop the spread of influenza were more successful in saving their cities and towns from poverty and death. Economies and societies were already crumbling after the Great War. So here's a little bit more context. Or crumbling after the Great War with the influenza, millions dying, adding to economic depression. So in this case, is this here enough to hey, enough to get the context point? So again, you can try for the context point once again after the restatement of the thesis. So this isn't a bad idea to do. I would still say it's not enough because you want to get that notion of connection. All these countries and colonies are being connected because of the industrial powers. That's why there's the possibility of a global pandemic in this case here. There's no example here of evidence beyond the document. Okay? But again, if the question is why there is or people's responses, okay, to pandemic, we're living in one right now. How did people respond beyond just simply what we see in the five documents in the five documents that we've laid out here? Okay, so if you can find something outside of that, that's evidence beyond the document as such. So let's go and finally come back to the rubric here. Okay, so at least one piece of evidence beyond the document. There was none here. There was no second attempt. And complex understanding, again, kind of a unicorn point. I wouldn't focus on that too much here. So we're having a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so 6 points, which is fantastic, actually. I think you're going to do pretty well if you can get somewhere between, and really the range we want to be in is probably around, my guess is 5 to 7. Okay, otherwise, good luck. Hope this helped in terms of understanding the essays that we've just done here. Right.